what is it going to take to build an infrastructure around ourselves that's not dependent upon any government agency. As we are confronted with this pandemic, it'll be something else next. Joining me to discuss this is, of course, my Wednesday partner in power, Loree Daniel Favors from the Center of Law and Social Justice at the Great Medgar Evers College in Brooklyn. Afro State of Mind, welcome. Of course, we have Drew McCaskill, who's my partner in power Mondays and Tuesdays now, crisis manager, one and only Drew McCaskill. And new to the family, I started reading her book, The Color of Money, and she messed me up. So I had to have her on to talk about how all of this is going to impact us. Let me welcome Mirza Baradaran. Welcome to the Karen Hunter Show. All right.
Thank you so much.
Welcome to our town hall. Let me be appropriate. All right. I'm going to start with you, Mirza. You wrote this book, which at first I was like, what does she know about Black wealth and the wealth gap? And this, so tell us a little bit about your background and what led you to this this understanding of the wealth gap.
So I'm not an expert in these issues, but I come at it as a banking person and looking at policy and the way that money is created and wealth is accumulated. So when you look at the top, how the Federal Reserve functions, how monetary policy works, that's where my work is. And when you see how those systems operate, and then you sort of put the lens on Black-owned banks. So I wanted to tell the story of Black-owned banks. You really start to see exactly how systemic racism embeds in a system to prevent Black communities and Black individuals from accumulating wealth. Insofar as it's a white-dominated society, it's really difficult, impossible, especially with the additional barriers erected constantly to actually build wealth and to equalize hundreds of years of oppression and inequality.
Give us one thing that was done that you said makes it impossible for that gap to be closed.
One of the most recent. I mean, there's 100 things that have been done that keep being done, but one of the most recent and long lasting is the segregation enacted by the New Deal and the way that creates two different systems of credit and value. So today, and for the last 100 years, a home in a white community is more valuable and builds more equity because it is in a white community, because it is not in a Black community. So that is how racism embeds in home values and equity. So that is a direct result of government and bank programs of redlining that essentially just said that any Black community, even if it was 10% Black, was inherently more risky and therefore less creditworthy than a white family. They just explicitly put that into these contracts. And so that lasted in a very long time. It lasts till today. And those wealth differentials, so today white families have 20 times more wealth than Black families. And this actually increases, the wealth gap increases the higher education you have. So it is not a gap that you can work yourself out of. It's just inherent in the structure of wealth. And wealth is much more stagnant and readily pass onable than income, than education, than all of that. So if your grandfather got an FHA mortgage, you likely have a buffer and wealth that if your grandfather was excluded because he was Black and only because he was Black, right? You do not have that buffer, and that buffer means $10,000 to start your business. And that's the least of it. It also means better schools, more social capital, more access to justice, less policing, less violence and trauma, and all of the ways that racism reproduces itself.
So today, the unemployment report came out. Another 6 million Americans apply for unemployment. Now we're up to 30 million over the last 6 weeks. Vast majority of them are from our community. Loree, Drew, how does that impact? What does that look like during this pandemic with what Mercer just said? How are we going to come out of it when we know financially the country is devastated? We are in a recession, COVID-related recession. Unemployment is at a record high. What does that look like, Loree, Drew?
So
Okay, I saw Drew nod, and I didn't know if he was going to jump in, so I'm going to just exercise some privilege. Just go for it. I think it looks like what it traditionally looks like at the end of a crisis, an economic crisis for Black communities. I remember at the end of the recession, and that was a time when I was an attorney in corporate law in corporate America, and that was when people didn't believe that lawyers could get laid off. And then you had thousands of lawyers being laid off all over the city of New York, all over California, every center that had traditionally employed corporate lawyers in mass. You saw masses of people being laid off. And because Black associates tended to be among the last hired, or they filled up diversity slots, when those layoff notices came, it tended to be Black and brown attorneys who were bearing the brunt of the layoffs. I think we see that across every industry when you have Black people who just recently made their entrees into these spaces because of the systemic racism that Mercer was talking about. Then you also have the reality that they have less seniority. They have less buy-in and community and business investment in their training and in their longstanding capacity to achieve at that particular institution. So if I'm an employer and I have a rash of employees, many of whom look like me, many of whom I see a little bit of myself in. And then I have a handful who are very recent, who are not a part of a community that I recognize as part of my own. When it comes to making decisions, those are going to be the ones who are most at risk. So when we looked at the foreclosure crisis, and during the foreclosure crisis, I was very active in defending homeowners. What you saw was in communities like Bedford-Stuyvesant, which was predominantly Black, had been for generations, those were the homes that were most likely to go into foreclosure. Why? Because Black communities and Black family members tended to have most of their wealth invested in their house. So as opposed to having a diversified portfolio of, say, stocks and bonds and diverse spaces where our money was held, for most of us, our greatest and most significant asset was, in fact, our house. And so when you lose your employment capacity and you're not in a position to be able to pay your mortgage, you are going to be bearing the brunt of the foreclosure crisis. And so what you saw was that you would go down to the foreclosure courts, and it was defendant after defendant after defendant. It looked like they could have been my mother, my cousin, my uncle, my brother, to the point where the judges would often assume that I, too, was someone who was there facing foreclosure because I looked just like the client.
Drew knows numbers, right? He this is his business. What Mercer said, what LaRee just said, it almost looks like it's insurmountable. But yeah. Give us more horrible numbers that.
Particularly as it relates to home ownership and wealth, what we have to remember is that home ownership and wealth are so closely tied together in this country. And you talk about traditions of redlining and housing discrimination in this country. White home ownership rate in this country right now is 73.7%. Black home ownership rates are at 44%. And if you then listen to what Mahersa has just said, is that those home values in Black neighborhoods. I lived in Atlanta for 15 years, and there are enclaves of Black neighborhoods with $1 million houses that during the housing crisis, those folks were at the risk of losing their homes. And these are people who are in the middle class, who are upper middle class, because their home values had not grown, right? Only because they were in Black neighborhoods. And so if you think about that on the middle class and then an upper middle class of our country and in our communities, the fragility of the Black middle class is the untold horror story of what we talk about when we talk about the American dream, because many of us spend a ridiculous amount of money to go to college and to get degrees and to go out and get that good job, right? And we move into neighborhoods because we want to continue to have some modicum of cultural connection, right? And we move into great Black neighborhoods, or we move back to our own neighborhoods, right? And what ends up happening is that our ability to do the same things that our non-Hispanic white counterparts do with the same amount of money is totally different. Even for African Americans who decide, I'm going to go out and start my own business, I'm not going to be a part of the corporate machine. 40% of the revenues of Black-owned businesses are located in the 5 most vulnerable sectors. That includes leisure, hospitality, and retail. 40% of the revenues from Black-owned businesses come from these really, really vulnerable sectors of the community, and that's compared to 25% of the revenues of all U.S. businesses, right? And so it's not just it's about where we live. It's about when we decide to go out and start our own businesses, what those businesses look like. And when you look at folks who are out there, who are making money, who are not running their own businesses, Black Americans are also vastly overrepresented in 9 of the 10 lowest paid high contact essential services, right? So Black folks are disproportionately represented in 9 of the 10 high touch essential services. And that only exacerbates, based on U.S. labor statistics and McKinsey, that only exacerbates our exposure and potential detriment of this disease to us. So you think about that. Limited access to high-wage jobs. Many of us are essential. We're talking about grocery, food service, custodial. We cannot stay at home. Largely, African Americans cannot stay at home. Black workers are the last hired and oftentimes the first fired. And Black families don't have the same safety net that our non-Hispanic white counterparts have, right? And so it leads you to the point to where you have to say Black folks are on the front lines of making sure that we all get food, that the food supply is still there, all of those things. If we are these essential workers, what is the government proposing to guarantee these people? I look at essential workers just like I look at 9/11 first responders. The government needs to have a program and a plan for essential workers and these essential workers. That how are we going to guarantee that they're going to be compensated for their service and that their health and their financial stability, they're going to be protected in perpetuity? What's the plan for that? Those are the things that we've got to ask our governments. We've got to demand that for them.
And then I think, Drew, I love when you do numbers. It makes my number-fearing heart so happy. But I think we also have to reconcile with what happens if we cannot make this system do that, right? So we often say, Karen, I've often said that we as communities of African descent who are still here in the United States, when there were a few key decision-making points where our ancestors had the choice to stay or to leave, those of us who are here, who trace our roots back here, we descended from those who chose to stay. And I think that history would suggest that we, yes, pressure this government to do everything that Drew just said, but then our plan A, because I actually think that's plan B, our plan A has to be what happens when the government refuses to do so? What happens when they say, you know what, racism is sort of going to be factored into our cost of doing business? We've seen that where the Supreme Court said, yeah, I know you've got statistics that show that racism contributes to more Black people going to the death penalty or getting incarcerated. But, we're not going to entertain that right now because it would make fixing the criminal justice system too burdensome. So we have to be clear that it is our responsibility to pressure the government to do that, but it is also our responsibility to Kujichagulia, that second principle of Kanza, which talks about self-determination. What do we do? How do we respond? What is our plan when the government says, not interested, not going to happen today?
You're listening to Coronavirus in Black, our virtual town hall here on Urban View, channel 126. That's Larry Daniel Favors. Drew McCaskill's here, and Mersa Baradaran. Did I pronounce your first name correctly? Because he said Mahersa. I want to make sure it's correct. Okay, Mersa Baradaran. Listen, we're learning. We're learning here. Yeah. You wrote a whole book. You did research on money, which as I started reading it, I realized my whole entire message around Black-owned banks was completely wrong based on what you found. And I'm going to have to make a pivot. No, I'm going to have to make a pivot on these airwaves because now I know more. And I'm just in the first several pages of this book. What happens when we can't depend on a government? When what you said earlier, that they set up a system that will always keep them in power, in money, in wealth. What do we do? What is the solution?
So just to be clear, my message is not that Black-owned banks shouldn't be supported. That is not my message.
No. But how?
Right. Yeah. They don't do predatory behavior. They have been the site of boycott and protest, and every Black leader, Malcolm X, Martin Luther King, W. Du Bois, Booker T. Washington, across the spectrum, have supported Black banks for different reasons. My thesis in the book is that the way that the white sort of political structure has offset the burden of closing the racial wealth gap onto Black institutions, that has been a decoy and a fake and a dead-end avenue, because Black banks alone, Black institutions alone, can't fix the problem that massive public policy created, right? So if all credit emanates from the Treasury and from the Fed and through the sort of mechanism of the mainstream banking industry, if everyone gains wealth, as Larry and Drew noted, that's middle-class people gain wealth through their homes. So, and that is because the government made a decision to subsidize mortgages and to bring the risks down through a secondary market. So these are policy decisions that completely cut out the Black community. So that's the means of wealth, and you're going to cut out a whole people from it, and then say, okay, well, you fix it by accumulating your funds into a bank and building wealth. That's not how wealth is created. Wealth is not created through individual savings. You cannot save your money into wealth. You should save, certainly. You should make the decisions with your money, but that has nothing to do with your wealth, unless you're saving up money for better parents who were rich, right? I mean, truly, like, that's how wealth is passed on. Wealth is passed on structurally. So I think as an individual, you make the decisions with your money. But if you're looking at the system and what created the racial wealth gap, it was not bad personal decisions. It was not a lack of savings, nor was it a lack of communities working together to save money and multiply it. That's not how money multiplies. Money has to multiply by tapping into the multiplication system of the Federal Reserve, of these credit policies, of the ways that money sort of flows out. I mean, you see the CARES Act, the Federal Reserve monetary policy, these are trillions of dollars created over a weekend.
So how do we plug into those?
The racial wealth gap.
How do we plug in? How do we get into neighborhoods where our property is valued? How do we create those neighborhoods if they're saying just by virtue of them being Black, they're already devalued? What options do we have? Because I want to live in this neighborhood, but I need my house value to be multiplied the way the house around the corner in a white neighborhood, right around the corner, by the way, is a white neighborhood, right around the corner from me. How do I magnify that in my neighborhood?
Well, I mean, there's two ways. One is to not make whiteness valuable, and we haven't been able to do that, right? Not to unplug race and wealth. The other is reparations. I mean, you have to fix the capital gap, and you can't fix the capital gap without. You need political power and massive outlays of funds. This has to be at the scale at which it was perpetuated. Every single institution in the federal government and in the private market helped create the racial wealth gap, and every institution must be involved in closing it. There's no other easy way out of it.
One of the things that speaks exactly to what she's talking about is quality of education access for African Americans and for young people of color. And here's one of the reasons why you need to do the census is because then once you do the census, you can actually look at the numbers in a very different way. Districts serving mostly students of color receive roughly $2,000 less per student than districts with the fewest students of color, right? And so you think about what she's saying about you can't save your way save your way into wealth to a certain extent, that government and policy has to change. So what we have to do is you think about that. What if that $2,000 delta was not there, right? What if there was an additional $2,000 spent towards every student in districts that have large proportions of students with color? Black Americans, I believe that you have a much smaller racial achievement gap if you put the resources towards those students. African American students and students of color are not achieving less because they have less capacity. They're achieving less because they have less investment in them. That's the only thing that is.
I would actually add to that, Drew, and say that African American students have less invested in them. But even when we see incidences where more is being invested, that more is being invested so that we can better prepare Black students to master whiteness. And so I think part of the challenge is that we often think of like Black banking or buying a house in a Black neighborhood, or do I send my child to this Black school, as sort of one-off options, one-off choices that are going to lead to some sort of massive shift in the wealth distribution in our country. And I think that, for example, if we were to look at housing, Black people who make housing decisions to buy outside of neighborhoods that have been devalued are part of a system that preferences whiteness and devalues Blackness. And we know that this happens because when white people buy in those same neighborhoods that Black people of means chose to avoid, they are able to shift what's happening in those community spaces. When white people gentrify Black neighborhoods and they join the civic engagement organizations that were left basically vacant because Black people who live in these communities often don't know that those positions are there. I'm speaking specifically, maybe I'm just talking about New York and Brooklyn, but what we often see is that there are white people who will move into Black neighborhoods, who will buy houses that Black home buyers refuse to even look at because of where they're situated. Yep. White people will purchase those homes, will invest in the upkeep, and they'll buy them for dirt cheap. So they're not counting on the white valued community as a source of their wealth. They're counting on purchasing this home or this property at dirt cheap, investing in the upkeep. And then you'll find that they come knocking on your door to have you sign a petition for what? To support them in the community council position that they're running for. Who knew there was a community council position? Not I, longstanding Black resident who has been here for the past 2 or 3 decades, because often I am divorced and separated from the leadership structures in the community. So you have white gentrifiers who purchase homes in Black neighborhoods for dirt cheap, participate in the leadership structure in things that we tend to avoid for cultural reasons, which we can talk about at some point in this segment. And they're able to essentially take over communities that Black people of means had opportunities to invest in but did not, for whatever reason. It's not blame. It's just talking about what can happen. And so I think that we have to be clear, because when we look at the city of Pittsburgh, for example, going back to education, Pittsburgh's Black students were being invested in, and this is in the early 2000s, at rates that exceeded most of what was happening in the state of Pennsylvania. Yet because they were still not receiving a culturally responsive education, the outcomes continued to produce negative academic gap realities. And so I think that a lot of times our frame of reference is if I have a Black-owned bank account, if I buy a house in a Black neighborhood, if I have a child in a Black school, then those acts enough are going to help shift the dynamics. And that's simply, those are acts, they're great, but they are not cultivating a way of life that is going to center Blackness such that we're able to see and in our communities invest within ourselves in ways that will have an all-in approach as opposed to a one-off, I made my good Black choice for the week approach, and then I'm going to move on to spending the 90% of my time celebrating whiteness.
It also requires a vision. In addition to the amount of money that is spent, they spend 3 times more money on special ed, which our children are also disproportionately classified as. You know, as we wrap up this, exactly. As we wrap, the purpose of today is we're in the midst of a pandemic that is impacting our health, that is impacting our wealth, is going to probably for a decade, maybe more. And my goal here is to have a conversation around how we stop and how we prevent it in the future. I'm going to give you guys a last word on that. Mirza, how do we prevent this from happening again, whatever this is that's going to take us down this path?
Yeah, I mean, I think partly the Trump administration has kind of blown open this idea that we live in a colorblind world. I mean, he's put race kind of front and center in his campaign. But in a way, this pandemic has also exposed the myth of colorblindness. This is a virus that is completely colorblind. It does not. We're all human and we're all equally susceptible. So why are Black people dying more? Because of the systems of inequality, because of their economic vulnerability, because they haven't had access to health care, because they are in those jobs that are more out there. And this has nothing to do with an inherent genetic trait. This is everything to do with structural power and economic vulnerability. And even, going to the point about the schools, everything in the society has been set up. And I don't mean it as a conspiracy theory. I think it was broad, open in daylight done. Everything was set up so that funds from white communities stayed in white communities. The reason why Black schools are defunded and Black healthcare facilities are defunded are because local taxation is such that the white property owners only pay for their own local institutions. And that tax system was also a result of racism. So to understand any of these funding flows, you have to look at who created them, and they're usually segregationists. And even in New York, I mean, we have this sense that the South was the only place that people were, segregated. Of course not, right? So that's it.
Loree? How do we prevent
I think I love this because I think that what we have to be clear about is that we are attempting to integrate into systems that were intentionally designed to exclude us, right? Whether that's the employment system, whether that's the housing system, the banking system, the school system, we are essentially living the reality of what it means to try to force people who have power over us, who do not like us, who have for the entirety of their history of systemic development have structured their systems to be at our disadvantage so that they benefit. We are essentially trying to make this relationship work, similar to how someone who is an abused spouse is trying to make a relationship with an abuser who is fully committed to maintaining the abuse work. And what I think we have to be, and I've said this before, Karen, on the show, I spent most of my childhood in Germany, and America to me reminds me of what would have happened had Hitler not been forced to leave, had he sort of been allowed to lay low and still produce the systems that he wanted to see uninterrupted. And so we have to ask ourselves, if this is what it's like to live with our Hitler, how do we imagine something different that does not require us to try to make people who have a demonstrated, well-documented research and footnoted history of despising our existence as human beings? What would it be like if our success did not depend on us trying to successfully convince them to see us as otherwise?
Drew, last word.
Last word, I will say number one thing that we've got to do is we've got to vote in November, and we've got to vote Donald Trump out of office. That is the number one thing we've got to do. The second thing is policy. African Americans need to get in the arena and start helping to write policy, helping to hold people accountable for policy. We are not going to just one off this. We have got to be concerted. We have got to be relentless with policy. Policy is what gets us. The American public owes us this. The American system owes us this. The government owes us this. We built this country. We should demand what we need in the same way, with that same fervor that we did when we were being forced to build this country. That is it. And then lastly is that what, as Loree said, all of those things about going to a black school and moving into a black neighborhood and shopping at a black store and going to a black bank, that is being black and woke in America 1.0. 2.0 is about strategy. All those things have been chess played.